English to Success. Your path to success.
Chapter 1. A New Beginning. A long time ago, in a country called Britain, life was very different from today. Britain was an island, surrounded by water. This meant that it was difficult for the people to travel to other countries. But Britain had something that would change everything: good ships. These ships were strong and fast, and they could carry people across the oceans. At the time, Spain and France were two of the strongest countries in the world. They were very rich and powerful, with large armies and big empires. Britain was smaller, but the people of Britain dreamed of becoming just as powerful as Spain and France. They decided to sail across the seas to discover new lands. The first big adventure began when Christopher Columbus, an explorer from Spain, discovered a new land called America. When Britain heard about this new world, they too wanted to explore it. But instead of sailing west, the British sailors sailed east. They had heard stories of a great land full of riches in India, and they decided to find it. In the year 1497, a brave explorer named John Cabot sailed from Britain. His ship was small, but it carried him to the coast of North America. He didn't know it yet, but his journey would help Britain begin its rise to greatness. The British also sent out other explorers like Sir Francis Drake, who was known for his daring and courage. He sailed around the world, meeting new people and bringing back treasures from faraway places. But there was one thing the British lacked: good land. In the early years of exploring, many of the British explorers did not find much that was useful to them. But then, in 1585, the British tried again. They established a colony in Virginia, which became the first permanent settlement in the New World. The people faced many difficulties. They didn't know how to grow food, and they didn't have enough supplies. But the British were strong, and they managed to survive. They soon realized that there were many possibilities for growth and wealth in these new lands. Chapter 2. Growing Power and Expanding Borders. As time passed, Britain began to grow in strength. The people had built good ships, and now they wanted to explore more lands and gain more power. Many explorers set sail, hoping to find new places for trade and riches. Britain's rulers, the monarchs, saw this as an opportunity to make Britain stronger. In the early 1600s, the British began to focus their attention on America. There was something in the New World that everyone wanted: land. The land in America was vast, and there was plenty of space to build farms, cities, and businesses. But there was a problem. There were already people living in America. The Native Americans had lived there for thousands of years. The British explorers didn't think about the people who lived on this land. They only saw the riches that could be made from it. In 1607, a group of British settlers arrived at a place called Jamestown in Virginia. This was the first permanent British settlement in America. The settlers didn't know what to expect. They faced many challenges. The land was wild, and there were many dangers. There were diseases, wild animals, and strange weather. At first, it seemed as if the colony might not survive. But the settlers were determined. They learned how to grow food, how to build stronger homes, and how to defend themselves. They planted tobacco, which became a very profitable crop. Soon, people from England were sending ships full of goods to help the colony grow. Britain's rulers were happy with this new success. In the next few years, more and more people came to America. The British settlers didn't just stay in Virginia, they moved further and further across the land. They built more towns and created more farms. The British were now looking beyond the shores of America to other parts of the world where they could find even more wealth. By 1620, another group of settlers arrived in a place called Plymouth. These people were called Pilgrims. They came to America not just to make money, but also to find a place where they could practice their religion freely. Like the settlers in Jamestown, the Pilgrims faced difficult times. They had to deal with harsh winters and food shortages, but they too survived. They learned from the Native Americans how to grow crops like corn and beans, which helped them survive. Meanwhile, Britain wasn't just focusing on America. The country was also looking at other parts of the world. Britain's rulers sent explorers to places like the Caribbean and India. These places offered rich lands for trade, and the British knew they could make money by sending ships to bring back spices, cotton, and gold. By the mid-1600s, Britain had started to build a network of colonies around the world. They built strong fortresses to protect their trading routes and lands. Britain's navy became very powerful. Ships filled with goods and soldiers sailed across the oceans, bringing wealth and power to the British Empire. In Africa, the British began to trade with local kingdoms. They offered goods like cloth, guns, and tools in exchange for gold and other valuable resources. They also began the slave trade. This was a dark and sad part of British history as millions of African men, women, and children were taken away from their homes and forced to work in the colonies. As the British Empire grew, so did the conflicts with other countries. The French and the Spanish were not happy to see Britain expanding. They also wanted to control more lands and wealth. The British had to fight to protect their colonies and trading routes. The battles were long and difficult, but the British Navy and their strong army helped them win many wars. In the 1700s, Britain's influence continued to grow. They controlled many parts of the world, from Canada in the north to Australia in the south. In India, the British East India Company grew powerful. They sent more soldiers to India and made the land part of the British Empire. By now, Britain had established itself as a global power. The country had many colonies, strong trade routes, and a mighty army. The British Empire was on its way to becoming one of the largest and most powerful empires the world had ever seen. But with great power came great challenges. As Britain grew stronger, more people in the colonies began to ask for freedom. They wanted to govern themselves and make their own decisions, but Britain was not ready to let go of its empire. The stage was being set for a conflict that would change everything. Chapter 3: The Battle for the Americas. As the 1700s rolled on, Britain's empire grew ever larger. In America, the British colonists were doing well. They had built strong communities, and many people were making money by growing tobacco, rice, and cotton. However, not everything was peaceful in the New World. Britain had rivals, particularly France and Spain, who were also expanding their empires in the Americas. The French had a large presence in North America, especially in Canada and the Mississippi River Valley. The Spanish controlled a vast part of the Caribbean, as well as large areas in the southwest United States and Mexico. These two powers were not happy to see Britain grow stronger and wanted to take the lands the British had claimed for themselves. In 1754, Britain and France went to war in what became known as the French and Indian War. This war was a part of a larger conflict called the 7 Years' War that was fought between the two countries around the world. The war in the Americas was particularly fierce, with both the French and British fighting to control land and resources. The British Army, along with their American colonists and Native American allies, fought against the French and their Indian allies. The battlefield stretched from the forests of Canada to the rivers of Virginia. The war was long and bloody, with both sides suffering heavy losses. However, the British, with their well-trained soldiers and powerful navy, were able to win important battles and push the French back. One of the key moments in the war came in 1759, when the British defeated the French at the Battle of Quebec. This battle, which took place in the heart of Canada, was a turning point. The French were forced to give up control of Canada and much of their land in North America. In 1763, the war finally ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, and Britain became the dominant power in North America. The victory in the French and Indian War helped solidify Britain's control over its American colonies. However, it also created new challenges. Britain was deeply in debt from fighting the war, and the government decided that the American colonists should help pay for the costs. They began to tax the colonies heavily, placing taxes on goods like tea, paper, and glass. This angered the colonists, who believed they should not be taxed without having a say in the British government. This tension between Britain and its colonies would set the stage for one of the most important events in world history, the American Revolution. Chapter 4: The American Revolution. In the 1760s and 1770s, the relationship between Britain and its American colonies grew increasingly strained. The colonists had enjoyed a certain amount of freedom and self-rule, but now the British government was making decisions for them without their consent. The colonists did not like being told what to do, especially by people far away in Britain. One of the biggest sources of frustration for the colonists was the Stamp Act, a law that taxed all printed materials, including newspapers, books, and legal documents. The colonists were angry. They had no representatives in the British Parliament, the government that made the laws. Many colonists felt that it was unfair for Britain to tax them without their approval. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," became popular among the colonists, as they demanded the right to have a voice in the laws that affected them. In 1773, tensions reached a breaking point when a group of colonists, disguised as Native Americans, boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and threw large amounts of tea into the water. This event became known as the Boston Tea Party. It was a bold and rebellious act, and the British government responded by punishing the colonists with the Intolerable Acts, a series of laws that took away many of their freedoms. The colonists were not afraid. They began to organize and prepare for the possibility of war. In 1775, The first shots of the American Revolution were fired at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. The British Army was sent to stop the colonists from rebelling, but the colonists fought back. The war had begun. For the next few years, the colonists fought against the British Army, which was one of the strongest in the world. The Americans, led by George Washington, fought for their independence. The British Army had many advantages, including better training and more powerful weapons, but the Americans had something the British lacked: determination and the will to fight for freedom. The war was long and difficult, but in 1781, the British Army was finally defeated at the Battle of Yorktown. The British general, Lord Cornwallis, was forced to surrender to George Washington and the American army. The American colonists had won their independence. Chapter 5. The Birth of a New Nation. After the American Revolution, the United States of America was born. The colonies that had once been controlled by Britain were now free and independent. But the new country faced many challenges. The 13 states had to figure out how to govern themselves and how to work together as a united nation. In 1787, representatives from the 13 states met in Philadelphia to write a new constitution. This document would serve as the foundation for the government of the United States. The leaders of the new country, including George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin, wanted to create a government that protected the rights of the people and ensured that no one person had too much power. The result was the U.S. Constitution, which was signed in 1787 and became the law of the land in 1789. The Constitution created a republic, a government in which the people elect leaders to make decisions for them. It also created a system of checks and balances to ensure that no branch of government could become too powerful. In 1789, George Washington became the first president of the United States. Washington was a hero of the Revolution, and his leadership was crucial in guiding the new nation. During his time in office, he helped establish many important institutions, including the Supreme Court and the National Bank. However, the United States was still very young, and many challenges lay ahead. There were debates over how much power the federal government should have versus the power of individual states. There were also disagreements about how to handle foreign relations and trade. Despite these challenges, the United States began to grow stronger, and its influence in the world began to rise. Chapter 6. Britain's Response. As the United States grew in power, Britain was forced to adjust. The loss of its colonies in America was a blow to the British Empire, but it did not mark the end of its global ambitions. Britain still controlled many territories around the world, including parts of Canada, India, and the Caribbean. In the early 19th century, Britain focused on maintaining its influence in these regions, while also looking for new places to expand. One of the most important areas for Britain was India. The British East India Company, a powerful trading company, had already established a presence in India, and the British began to increase their control over the country. At the same time, Britain was also involved in Africa. European countries were beginning to compete for control of African territories, and Britain sought to expand its empire on that continent. Britain was involved in several wars and conflicts to protect its colonies and its trade routes. Though the loss of the American colonies was a major event, Britain was far from finished. It would continue to grow in power, and its empire would remain one of the largest in the world for many years to come. Chapter 7: The Industrial Revolution. The 18th century brought huge changes to Britain. One of the most important changes was the Industrial Revolution, a time when Britain became the first country to develop large factories, machines, and advanced technologies. Before this, most people in Britain worked on farms or in small shops. But with new inventions, everything started to change. It all started in the late 1700s with the invention of new machines like the steam engine by James Watt. These machines could power factories and trains, making it possible to produce goods faster and cheaper than ever before. The steam engine was also used to power ships, allowing people to travel more quickly across the seas. As the factories grew, people began to move from the countryside to the cities to find work. Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool became busy industrial cities. There were many jobs available, but the conditions were often harsh. Workers, including men, women, and even children, worked long hours for little pay. Many lived in crowded, dirty conditions. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution made Britain wealthier. New factories produced textiles, iron, and coal, which were sold to other countries. This wealth allowed Britain to expand its influence even further. The British Empire grew larger, and the country became a center of global trade and power. However, there were many problems caused by the Industrial Revolution. The rise of factories led to pollution, poor living conditions, and the spread of diseases. People started to protest and demand better working conditions, leading to important changes in the laws to protect workers. Chapter 8: The Expansion into Africa. As Britain became more powerful and wealthier, it looked for new lands to control. Africa was one of the places that Britain set its sights on. In the late 19th century, European countries started to explore and divide Africa between them in a process known as the Scramble for Africa. Britain was interested in Africa for many reasons. It wanted to gain control of important resources like gold, diamonds, and rubber, and also to have more territory to expand its empire. Britain took control of many countries in Africa, including Egypt, South Africa, and parts of West Africa. In Egypt, Britain built the Suez Canal, a waterway that connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. This was a very important project because it made trade between Europe and Asia faster and cheaper. The canal was controlled by Britain for many years, and it became one of the most important parts of the British Empire. In South Africa, Britain fought wars against the Boers, Dutch-descended settlers, for control of the land. The Boer War, also known as the South African War, lasted from 1899 to 1902 and was a very difficult and bloody conflict. However, in the end, Britain succeeded in taking control of South Africa. By the early 1900s, Britain had become the largest empire in the world, with colonies and territories in every part of the globe. Its empire stretched from Canada to Australia, from India to Africa, and even to some parts of China. Chapter 9: The First World War. The British Empire was at its peak in the early 1900s, but it was also a time of great tension in Europe. World War I, also known as the First World War, began in 1914 and involved many of the world's most powerful countries. It was a brutal and devastating war that lasted 4 years. The war started when a Serbian nationalist assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. This event led to a chain reaction of countries declaring war on each other. Britain, along with its allies, such as France and Russia, fought against the Central Powers, which included Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Ottoman Turkey. The war was fought on many fronts, including the trenches of France, the deserts of Africa, and the seas of the Atlantic Ocean. The British Army had to fight not only against soldiers, but also against new weapons like machine guns, tanks, and airplanes. The war caused millions of deaths and changed the world forever. Britain was part of the winning side, but it paid a high price. The war had caused many deaths, both in battle and because of disease. The British economy was also badly affected, as it had to spend a lot of money on the war. Many of Britain's colonies, such as India and Australia, sent soldiers to help in the war, and this contributed to the spread of new ideas about independence and freedom. In 1918, the war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty punished Germany and led to the creation of new countries in Europe. However, the peace was not to last long, and the world would soon be plunged into another great war. Chapter 10: The Second World War. By 1939, the world was on the brink of another global conflict. Adolf Hitler, the leader of Nazi Germany, had begun to expand his empire by invading other countries in Europe. Britain, along with France, declared war on Germany in September 1939, marking the beginning of World War II. This war was even bigger and more destructive than the First World War. It was fought on every continent and involved many countries, including the United States, Japan, and the Soviet Union. Britain faced the threat of invasion, especially after Germany defeated France in 1940. The British people showed incredible courage during this time. The Battle of Britain in 1940 was a key moment in the war. The Royal Air Force, RAF, fought off waves of German bombers and fighter planes, protecting Britain from being invaded. The battle lasted for months, and the British victory was a turning point in the war. In the early years of the war, Britain was also heavily bombed by Germany in a campaign known as the Blitz. Cities like London were hit hard, and many people lost their lives. But the British never gave up. They kept fighting and, with the help of their allies, managed to turn the tide of the war. In 1944, the D-Day invasion took place. British, American, and Canadian soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy, France, and began the liberation of Western Europe from Nazi control. By 1945, Germany had been defeated, and the war in Europe was over. However, the war in the Pacific continued until August 1945, when the United States dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. Japan surrendered soon after, and the war officially ended. Chapter 11: The end of the British Empire. After World War II, Britain's empire began to shrink. The war had left Britain weakened, both economically and politically. Many countries that had been part of the British Empire started to demand independence. In India, the most valuable British colony, the fight for independence had been growing for years. Mahatma Gandhi led a non-violent resistance movement, and in 1947, India became an independent country. The same year, Pakistan was also created, separating from India due to religious differences. Other countries followed India's example. In the 1950s and 1960s, many British colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean gained their independence. Countries like Egypt, Kenya, Jamaica, and Malaysia became free from British rule. The loss of these colonies marked the end of the British Empire. However, Britain remained an important country on the world stage, and it continued to influence global events, especially as a member of the United Nations and the Commonwealth of Nations. Britain's role in the world had changed, but it still had a rich history of global influence and achievement. The legacy of the British Empire is complex, with both positive and negative aspects. Some people benefited from the empire's rule, while others suffered under it.